The morning sun rose over the sprawling ranch of Santiago Alencar, casting long, sharp shadows across the pristine fences and glinting off the polished brass nameplate at the entrance. Alencar Equine Elite. The air smelled of fresh hay and ambition, but beneath the surface was an undercurrent of tension, a tension that clung to the ranch like dust to old leather. Santiago strode down the main aisle of the stables, his polished boots tapping against the cobblestone floor with a precision that matched his demeanor. He was a man of results, of perfection. To him, horses weren't companions or creatures to be cherished. They were investments, assets to be shaped into profit-generating champions. His piercing gaze swept across the rows of immaculate stalls, each occupied by a horse groomed to mirror his high standards. His presence alone was enough to tighten the shoulders of his employees, who scurried out of his way like mice avoiding a cat. "Mateus!" Santiago barked, his voice slicing through the ambient murmur of the stable. Mateus, a wiry man with calloused hands and a weathered face, stepped forward, clutching his cap nervously. "Yes, Mr. Alencar?" Santiago's sharp features twisted into a frown as he reached Aurora's stall. The mare stood motionless, her sides heaving with labored breaths. She was a vision of fading grandeur, her coat dull, her once proud posture weighed down by the burden of pregnancy. "This," Santiago spat, pointing at the mare as if she were a broken chair, "is unacceptable. I don't pay for mediocrity, Mateus. I pay for results." Mateus swallowed hard, his eyes flickering to Aurora. She was a good horse, gentle and loyal. He had tended to her for years, watched her grow into a proud competitor before the complications of her pregnancy. "Sir, she just needs some time and care. We can—" Santiago's glare cut him off mid-sentence. "Time?" he sneered. "Time doesn't bring in revenue. That mare is a liability. Do you know what happens when you let liabilities linger, Mateus? They infect the whole operation." Mateus took a shaky breath, trying to summon the courage to push back. "But Mr. Alencar, Aurora's foal could still—" "Enough!" Santiago's voice thundered through the stable, sending a flock of sparrows fluttering from the rafters. "Do you want to argue with me, Mateus? Because I can find 100 men willing to take your place by the end of the day." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mateus's shoulders sagged. He couldn't lose this job, not with 2 kids at home and bills piling up. "No, sir," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Santiago turned on his heel, his long coat sweeping behind him like a shadow. "Good. Then do what needs to be done. Get rid of her. Today." Mateus stood frozen as Santiago disappeared down the aisle, barking orders at other employees. He felt a knot of anger and shame tighten in his chest. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he turned back to Aurora. She looked at him with wide, trusting eyes, as if unaware of the fate that had just been decided for her. "I'm sorry, girl," Mateus whispered, stepping into her stall. His voice cracked with the weight of his guilt. "I don't have a choice." The truck rumbled to life as Mateus tightened the straps around Aurora, securing her in the trailer. She didn't resist. She was too weak, too tired. The journey to the desert was a blur of gravel roads and swirling dust clouds, each mile carving a deeper chasm of regret into Mateus's heart. When he reached the edge of the arid expanse, he stopped the truck and stepped out, the heat hitting him like a wall. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a barren wasteland of cracked earth and relentless sun. He opened the trailer door, his hands trembling as he unlatched Aurora's harness. "Go on, girl," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. She hesitated, her ears twitching as if sensing the betrayal in his tone. I'm sorry." Aurora stepped down, her legs wobbling under the strain. She stood still for a moment, her head turning back toward Mateus as if pleading for an explanation. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Reaching into the back of the truck, Mateus pulled out a small bundle of hay and a canister of water. He placed them in the meager shade of a lone mesquite tree, the only semblance of shelter in the unforgiving landscape. "It's not enough," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I know it's not enough." He climbed back into the truck and slammed the door, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. As he drove away, he caught a final glimpse of Aurora in the rearview mirror. She was standing still, her silhouette framed by the shimmering waves of heat rising from the ground. Mateus cursed under his breath, pounding the dashboard in frustration. "Damn you, Santiago," he muttered. But deep down, he knew the curse wasn't meant for Santiago alone. Her legs buckled beneath her as the sun climbed higher into the sky. The bundle of hay was untouched. The water canister lay tipped over, its contents soaked into the parched earth. She sank to the ground, her body heaving with shallow breaths. The desert was silent save for the mournful whisper of the wind. The horse closed her eyes, her once bright spirit dimmed by exhaustion and despair. Far away, the ranch continued its hum of productivity, oblivious to the life fading in the desert. And Santiago Alencar, seated in his air-conditioned office, signed off on another lucrative deal, blissfully indifferent to the cost of his decisions. Luya, a 17-year-old girl, lived on a small farm at the edge of the village. Ever since her father's sudden passing, the weight of the family rested squarely on her young shoulders. Her mother, frail and bedridden, needed constant care, while her two younger siblings, just 6 and 9, depended on her entirely. Despite their struggles, Luya remained steadfast and optimistic. She had to. No one else could hold the family together. The farm wasn't much. A sagging wooden fence surrounded a handful of weathered structures. A few hens pecked in the dirt, and an aging cow rested in the corner of a paddock. It was all her father had left them, and it barely got them through each day. Still, to Luya, the farm was a sanctuary, a place full of memories of her father's laughter, her siblings' carefree games, and evenings spent watching the sunset together. That morning, Luya rose early, tending to her daily chores before her siblings woke. She gently pressed a kiss to her mother's forehead and ensured her medication was within reach. Turning to the two younger children, she reminded them, "Don't leave the house until I'm back, all right? And finish your schoolwork." They nodded, though the younger boy pouted, wanting to follow her out. Luya smiled and tousled his hair before stepping outside. By mid-afternoon, Luya was at the edge of a rocky ravine, collecting firewood. The dry heat of the plains pressed down on her, making every movement feel heavier. The wind rustled through the sparse bushes, carrying with it a faint sound. She froze, her bundle of sticks slipping from her hands. The sound came again, a weak, broken noise like the labored breath of an injured animal. Her eyes scanned the horizon, but the rocky landscape revealed nothing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No answer came, only the whisper of the wind. Curiosity battled with caution, but something inside her refused to let her walk away. Leaving the bundle behind, she climbed down into the ravine, her bare feet slipping occasionally on the loose stones. The sound grew clearer as she descended. Finally, she saw it. A horse. The animal lay on its side, its body emaciated, its chest heaving with shallow, painful breaths. Its coat, once a rich brown, was matted with dirt and grime, and its ribs pressed starkly against its skin. But what struck Luya most was the swollen curve of its belly. The mare was pregnant. Oh, dear God! Luya whispered, dropping to her knees. The horse's head shifted slightly, its dark, glassy eyes meeting hers. It didn't flinch or struggle, as if it lacked the strength even to fear her. "You poor thing," she murmured, reaching out cautiously. Her fingers brushed against the mare's muzzle, feeling the faint warmth of its breath. For a moment she hesitated. What could she possibly do? Her family was barely surviving as it was. Taking in a sick, pregnant horse seemed impossible. But as she sat there, staring into the mare's tired eyes, she knew she couldn't turn away. "You're coming with me," she said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. The journey back was grueling. As Luya adjusted the makeshift rope around the mare's neck, the fading sunlight caught something glinting on a small metal tag tangled in the horse's tangled mane. She carefully reached out, her fingers brushing the engraved letters. "Aurora." "Come on, Aurora," Luya urged, tugging on a makeshift rope she'd fashioned from an old scarf. The mare staggered to her feet, her legs trembling like saplings in a storm. They managed a few steps before Aurora collapsed again, her knees buckling beneath her. Luya crouched beside her, stroking her neck. "We'll rest for a moment," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "But we're not giving up, okay?" The sun dipped lower in the sky as they trudged across the dry plains. Luya wrapped her shawl around Aurora's back to shield the mare from the relentless heat, even as sweat soaked through her own clothes. Hours passed. The horizon stretched endlessly, and every step felt harder than the last. The plains seemed to mock them, offering no shade, no water, only more of the same cracked earth and scorching heat. Luya tightened her grip on the makeshift rope around Aurora's neck, her own legs trembling with exhaustion. "Come on, Aurora," she whispered, though her throat was parched and her voice barely audible. The mare's hooves stumbled over loose stones and her legs buckled. She crumpled to the ground in a cloud of dust, her labored breathing loud and uneven. For a moment, Luya stood frozen, panic welling up inside her. "No," she said aloud, more to herself than the horse. "You can't stop now. We're so close." Dropping to her knees, she cradled Aurora's head, brushing the dirt from her muzzle. The mare's dark eyes fluttered open, meeting Luya's. There was a flicker of recognition, a faint spark of trust, but it was fading fast. Luya scrambled to her feet and reached for the canteen strapped to her belt. It was almost empty, just a few precious drops sloshing at the bottom. She hesitated, glancing at the mare and then at the distant outline of her family's farm. If she drank it herself, it might give her the strength to keep going. But as she looked back at Aurora, collapsed and defeated, she made her choice. "I need you alive," she muttered, unscrewing the cap. Tilting the canteen, she poured the last of the water into her cupped hand and held it out. Aurora's nostrils flared as she sniffed, then lapped at the water with a desperate urgency. "All right," Luya said after a moment, her voice shaking but determined. She tied the rope more securely and braced herself. "Let's try this again." It took everything she had to get Aurora back on her feet. The mare's legs wobbled dangerously, but she stayed upright, leaning heavily against Luya. Together they shuffled forward, step by agonizing step. As they trudged on, Luya began to hum a tune, a simple, lilting melody her father used to sing while tending the animals. The sound of it, soft and familiar, seemed to reach Aurora in a way that words couldn't. The mare's ears twitched, and her breathing steadied, just enough to keep her moving. "You know this one, don't you?" Luya murmured, her voice cracking from the strain. She started singing softly, the words spilling out between gasps for air. "Sun's going down, but we're still here. Keep on walking, don't show no fear." It wasn't much, but it filled the silence, pushing back the overwhelming stillness of the desert. Ally fell, bringing a fleeting reprieve from the brutal heat. The stars appeared one by one, casting a faint glow over the barren landscape. Luya spotted a large rock formation up ahead, its shadow stretched long and cool across the ground. "This is it," she said, guiding Aurora toward the shade. "We'll rest here for a while." The mare collapsed almost immediately, her sides heaving as she lay on the ground. Luya knelt beside her, her own body screaming for rest. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a handful of dry grass she'd managed to grab before leaving the ravine. "Here," she said, holding it out. Aurora hesitated, then took a tentative bite. "That's it, girl," Luya whispered. "You've still got fight in you." She leaned back against the rock, her head tilting up to the sky. The stars blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't afford to cry, not yet. By the time they reached the edge of the farm, Luya's vision blurred with exhaustion. The sight of the weathered fence, familiar and comforting, sent a wave of relief crashing over her. "We're here," she whispered, more to herself than Aurora. Her siblings ran out from the house, their eyes wide with surprise. "Luya! What happened?" her younger brother shouted. "It's a long story," she replied, her legs giving way as she sank to her knees. "Help me get her inside." The children didn't hesitate. They fetched water, hay, and blankets, working quickly and quietly under Luya's instructions. Aurora lay down in the small paddock, her body finally able to rest without fear. The warm, comforting glow of the morning sun settled over Luya's small farm, the peaceful hum of a new day unfolding. Aurora lay in the modest paddock, her body still weak, but no longer trembling with exhaustion. She breathed steadily now, a far cry from the shallow, labored gasps of the day before. Luya stood by the fence, her hand resting on the worn wooden beam as she watched the mare doze. Her siblings hovered nearby, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. The younger boy, Jacob, tilted his head, squinting at the horse. "She doesn't look like she's going to make it, Luya," he said softly, earning a quick nudge from his older sister, May. "Don't say that," May scolded. "She just needs some care, that's all." Luya stayed quiet, her mind racing. She'd felt the same doubt gnawing at her since the moment she'd brought Aurora home. The farm barely provided enough for her family. How could they possibly afford to care for a sick, pregnant horse? And yet, the thought of giving up on Aurora felt unbearable. That evening, the family gathered around the small wooden table for dinner. The meal was simple, as always. Stew made from a handful of vegetables and scraps of meat Jacob had managed to trade for in the village. Their mother, pale and frail but sharp-eyed, was the first to speak. "Luya," she said, her voice steady despite its softness, "we need to talk about the horse." Luya's heart sank, but she nodded. She had known this conversation was coming. "It's not that we don't care," her mother continued, glancing at the two younger children, "but we can barely keep ourselves fed. You've done so much already, but keeping her, it's going to take more than we have." "She's not just a horse," Luya said quickly, her voice firm. "She's alive. She's depending on us now." Jacob frowned. "But what if she doesn't survive? What if the foal doesn't survive? Then all that effort and all that food is wasted." Luya's fists tightened under the table, but May jumped in before she could respond. "And what if they do survive?" May said, her eyes bright. "What if the foal grows up strong? It could help us, couldn't it? Pull the cart, maybe even plow the fields one day." Their mother raised a hand, silencing the argument. She looked at Luya, her expression unreadable. "You're the one who brought her here, Luya. Tell me, what do you think we should do?" Luya hesitated. She didn't want to burden her family, but every fiber of her being screamed that Aurora deserved a chance. "She's not just some mouth to feed," Luya said finally. "She's a fighter. She's already survived so much, and she's carrying a life inside her. If we give her up now, we'll lose more than a horse. We'll lose the chance to save something worth saving." The room fell silent. Jacob looked down at his empty bowl, and May fiddled with the frayed edge of her sleeve. Finally, their mother sighed. "All right," she said, her voice weary but resolute. "We'll do it. We'll care for her. But Luya, you'll have to make sure she pulls through. I can't have her suffering, understand?" Luya nodded, her heart swelling with relief and determination. "I promise, Mama. I'll do everything I can." Over the next few weeks, the family worked together to nurse Aurora back to health. Luya spent hours by the mare's side, cleaning her wounds and feeding her scraps of hay mixed with warm mash. May took over many of Luya's other chores, leaving her free to focus on Aurora, while Jacob hauled water and fetched what little extra feed they could afford. Even their mother helped when she could, her gentle hands stroking the mare's neck as she murmured quiet encouragements. Slowly, Aurora began to regain her strength. Her coat grew shinier, her eyes brighter, and her belly, round and full with the foal, seemed to promise new life. But just as hope began to take root, disaster struck. It was a cold, windless night when the first signs appeared. Luya was woken by the sound of frantic neighing and thudding hooves. She grabbed her shawl and bolted outside, her heart pounding. Aurora was in the paddock, pacing in uneven circles, her sides heaving with effort. "Mama!" Luya called, her voice sharp with panic. "It's happening!" Her mother and siblings rushed out, their faces pale in the moonlight. "What do we do?" May asked, clutching her mother's arm. Luya didn't have an answer. Aurora's body trembled violently, and the mare let out a low, guttural sound that made Luya's stomach twist. "We need to help her," Luya said, running toward the paddock. "Be careful!" her mother called after her, but Luya didn't stop. She knelt by Aurora's side, her hands shaking as she stroked the mare's neck. "You've got this," she whispered. "Just hold on a little longer." The labor was grueling, stretching on for what felt like hours. Aurora collapsed several times, her strength fading fast, but Luya refused to leave her side. She sang softly, the same tune her father had once used to calm the animals. Her voice cracked and faltered, but she kept going. Finally, just before dawn, the foal was born. For a terrifying moment, it didn't move. It lay in the straw, still and silent, and Luya's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, no!" Aurora, though weak and trembling, stretched her neck toward the foal. She began to lick it, nudging its tiny body with her nose. And then, a sound. A weak, gasping whinny. The foal lifted its head, its dark eyes blinking open for the first time. Luya let out a sob of relief, collapsing back onto the straw as her family crowded around. "We did it," May whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We actually did it." Luya looked at the tiny foal, its thin legs wobbling as it tried to stand. "Sul," she said softly. "Your name is Sul, because you're the light we've been waiting for." Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder, smiling faintly. "And now, we'll make sure that light never goes out." 2 years had passed since that fragile beginning, and in those years, Sul had grown into a striking, powerful creature, a symbol of resilience, hope, and a testament to the bond between him and the family who saved him. The villagers, many of whom had first doubted the family's decision to keep Aurora and her foal, now saw Sul as more than just an animal. He had become a companion, a helper, and in many ways a member of their small, tight-knit community. "Sul, over here!" called young Jacob, now a lanky 9-year-old. He stood at the edge of a muddy field, waving his arms wildly. Sul, his golden-brown coat shimmering in the morning light, charged forward with a burst of energy that belied his size. The plough, strapped to his broad shoulders, cut clean lines through the earth as he worked beside Jacob, who puffed up his chest with pride. "He's quicker than the old ox ever was," muttered Mr. Carter, one of the village elders. Standing a few feet away, he leaned on his cane, a mixture of admiration and disbelief flickering across his weathered face. "Never thought I'd see a horse like that round these parts." "Sul's not just a horse," Jacob said, planting his fists on his hips. "He's family." The elder chuckled, his grey beard twitching as he nodded. "That he is, boy. That he is." In truth, Sul had become indispensable to the villagers. Whether it was pulling heavy carts loaded with firewood or racing to fetch the doctor for a sick child, Sul was always there. His intelligence seemed almost uncanny at times. He knew which gates to nudge open, which doors to knock against when someone needed help. "Smart as a whip, that one," Mrs. Green had remarked after Sul had carried her sacks of grain back from the mill without so much as a nudge from Luya. "It's like he knows what you need before you do." And so, word began to spread. Luya knew the attention was inevitable. It had started with small requests, local farmers asking if Sul could help with their harvests, children pleading for rides on his strong back. Then came the competitions. The first was a local ploughing contest. Luya had hesitated at first, unsure if Sul's presence would draw too much attention, but the villagers insisted. "He's the best we've got," they'd said. And they were right. Sul didn't just win, he dominated. His strength and speed left everyone in awe, and the prize money, though modest, was enough to ease the family's struggles for a few months. After that, invitations to other contests poured in. Sul and Luya traveled to nearby villages where he competed in everything from hauling contests to obstacle races. Each victory brought cheers and more whispers of the extraordinary horse. But it wasn't just the victories that captured hearts. It was the way Sul worked with Luya, the trust and understanding that seemed almost magical. She didn't need reins to guide him. A quiet word or gentle pat was enough. Together, they were unstoppable. It was during one of these competitions that Santiago Alencar first heard of Sol. Sitting in his polished leather chair in a sprawling office far removed from the dusty village, Santiago read the letter with a growing sense of curiosity. "A horse?" he muttered, leaning back and rubbing his chin. The details were vague, but the description of Sul's abilities intrigued him. Strength, intelligence, obedience. All the traits Santiago prized in a champion. He set the letter down and snapped his fingers at his assistant. "Find out everything you can about this horse and the girl who owns him. If he's as good as they say, I want him." Santiago's men arrived at the farm a week later, stepping out of a sleek black car that looked out of place against the simple backdrop of the village. They offered Luya an impressive sum, enough to fix the farm, pay off debts, and ensure the family's comfort for years. For a moment, Luya hesitated. She thought of her siblings, her mother, and the constant worry that came with scraping by. But then she looked at Sul, standing proud and calm beside her. "He's not for sale," she said firmly. The men pressed, raising the offer, their words smooth and persuasive. But Luya stood her ground, her voice steady as she repeated, He's not for sale. The tension lingered long after the men left, their car kicking up a trail of dust as it disappeared over the hill. That night, Luya sat by the paddock, her fingers brushing Sol's mane as she whispered, "They don't understand, do they? You're not just a horse. You're everything." Not long after, an invitation arrived for Sol to compete in an international tournament, a chance to prove himself on a grand stage. Luya's heart soared at the opportunity, but sank just as quickly when she saw the entry fees and travel costs. It was more money than the family could dream of. The villagers, however, were determined. "Sol's brought us so much," Mrs. Green said at a town meeting. "It's time we give something back." And so they rallied together. The women baked pies to sell, the men offered their crafts for auction, and children went door to door collecting coins. But as the days passed, it became clear that their efforts, though heartfelt, wouldn't be enough. The weight of disappointment hung heavy over the village. As the days wore on and the villagers' tireless efforts failed to reach the goal, a cloud of despair settled over the community. Even Luya, who had always found strength in her unwavering determination, felt the weight of their failure pressing down. Sitting by Sol's paddock one evening, she ran her fingers through his mane, her heart heavy with the thought that this dream, this chance, might slip away. "You've brought us so far," she whispered, her voice catching. "I just wish I could do more for you." Sol nickered softly, nudging her shoulder as if to reassure her. But reassurance felt hollow when the mounting costs and looming deadlines offered no mercy. Meanwhile, in his sprawling estate, Santiago Alencar paced his office with a growing sense of irritation. The reports from his agents confirmed what he already suspected. Luya had refused to sell Sol, no matter the offer. That alone was infuriating enough. He was not a man accustomed to hearing no. "Who does she think she is?" Santiago growled, slamming his glass of scotch onto his desk. The liquid sloshed violently, mirroring the storm of his temper. His assistant, standing awkwardly by the door, hesitated before speaking. "She's, just a girl from a small village, sir. Maybe just a girl?" Santiago snapped, cutting him off. "That just a girl has outmaneuvered me. Me." The assistant fell silent, and Santiago's mind raced. If he couldn't buy Sol outright, he'd find another way. "Start digging," he ordered coldly. "Find everything you can on her, her family, that ridiculous village. Everyone has a weakness. And when we find hers, we'll use it." Within weeks, Santiago's pressure began to ripple through the village. Quiet deals were struck to raise the price of feed and supplies, making it harder for Luya's family to maintain their fragile existence. Rumors spread, sowing doubt about whether Sol truly belonged in competitions or if he was just a fluke. The strain was palpable. Luya noticed her mother growing more reserved, her siblings casting anxious glances at the dwindling food stores. But no one voiced to the underlying fear that Santiago's reach might be too vast for them to escape. Still, Luya refused to give up. One afternoon, as Luya brushed Sol in the shade of the barn, a journalist arrived. She was from a local paper and had heard about the remarkable horse and the young girl who raised him. "This could help," the journalist had said, her voice warm and hopeful. "A story like yours might inspire people to lend their support." Luya hesitated, unsure if more attention was wise. But as she looked at Sol, his dark eyes filled with trust, she decided to take the chance. The interview was raw and heartfelt. Luya spoke about her father's passing, the hardships her family endured, and how Aurora, Sol's mother, had been abandoned in the desert. Her voice trembled as she described finding Aurora, weak and struggling, and how their bond had grown from that moment. She taught me that even when things seem hopeless, you can still survive, Luya said, her gaze steady. And Sul. He's more than a horse. He's proof that love and determination can create miracles. When the article was published, it spread further than anyone expected. Santiago came across the article by chance, sitting in his lounge late one evening. He wasn't particularly interested in the newspaper a colleague had left behind, but the headline caught his eye. Desert Foal rises to stardom, the unbreakable bond of Luya and Sol. As he read, Santiago felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. The details were uncomfortably familiar. Aurora, abandoned in the desert, left to die. His mind filled with images of that day. The mare's collapsing frame, her pleading eyes, the orders he had barked without a second thought. The article went on to describe how Luya had fought to save Aurora, how she had nursed her back to health, and how Sul had become a symbol of hope for an entire village. A photo accompanied the piece, showing Luya standing beside Sul, her face radiant with pride and love. She saved her, Santiago muttered, his voice barely audible. The paper trembled in his hands. For the first time in years, guilt gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. He thought of Aurora, of the cruel decision he'd made, and of the life he'd dismissed as worthless. A week later, Santiago sat in a meeting with his business partners. They were discussing upcoming acquisitions, but his mind was elsewhere. It wasn't until one of them, a stout man with a booming voice, brought up Sol that Santiago snapped back to attention. "Remarkable horse," the man said. "And that girl, she's got grit. Makes you wonder how many worthless animals we've thrown away, eh?" The comment hit Santiago like a blow. Worthless. The word echoed in his mind, laced with bitter irony. That night, alone in his study, Santiago made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could do something now. He wrote a letter and enclosed a check for an anonymous donation, one large enough to cover Luya's entry fees and travel costs for the international competition. "Make sure she gets this," he told his assistant the next morning, his voice quieter than usual. As the deadline for the competition loomed, Luya sat on the edge of her bed, her heart heavy with resignation. They had tried everything, fundraisers, auctions, even borrowing from neighbors. But it still wasn't enough. Then, on the final day, a courier arrived with an envelope. Luya opened it with trembling hands, her breath catching as she saw the amount. It was more than enough. Where did this come from?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The courier shrugged. "Anonymous donor, miss. Said it was for you and Sul." Overwhelmed, Luya clutched the envelope to her chest. She didn't know who had sent the money, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Sul had a chance. As she stepped outside to tell her family and the villagers, Sul nickered softly, nudging her shoulder. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "We won't let them down, boy. Not you. Not them. Not anyone." The arena buzzed with an energy that was both electrifying and daunting. Flags from nations around the world fluttered in the crisp morning breeze, and the air carried the mingled scents of freshly turned soil, leather tack, and anticipation. The international competition had begun, and every corner of the grandstands was packed with spectators, eager to witness the finest equestrian athletes. Luya stood at the edge of the field, her hands gripping the reins loosely as she steadied her breathing. Sul stood beside her, his golden-brown coat gleaming in the sunlight, his ears flicking in all directions as if absorbing the atmosphere. The sight of the massive arena with its towering jumps and intricate obstacles made her heart race. "You ready, boy?" she whispered, brushing a hand down Sul's neck. He responded with a soft nicker, his eyes calm and steady in contrast to the storm brewing in her chest. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, signaling the start of the first round. Riders from around the globe guided their horses into the ring, each team moving with precision and purpose. The competition was fierce. These were seasoned riders with years of experience and horses bred for perfection. Luya felt a pang of doubt as she watched one competitor after another clear the course flawlessly. The jumps seemed impossibly high, the water hazards daunting. Compared to these polished teams, she and Sul were underdogs in every sense of the word. But when their turn came, Luya pushed the doubts aside. "We've got this," she said, more to herself than Sul. As they entered the arena, the crowd quieted, all eyes on the pair. The first few jumps went smoothly. Sul moved with a grace that belied his size, clearing each obstacle with ease. Luya's heart lifted as they gained momentum, her confidence building with every successful leap. The crowd began to murmur in admiration, impressed by the bond between horse and rider. Then came the turn, a tight, hairpin curve leading into a towering vertical jump. Luya gave Sul the signal, and he surged forward, his hooves pounding against the dirt. But as he approached the jump, his footing slipped on the loose ground. The gasp from the crowd was audible as Sul stumbled, his body lurching forward. Luya felt herself thrown off balance, her grip tightening instinctively on the reins. Sul's knee hit the ground, sending up a plume of dust. For a terrifying moment, everything seemed to stop. Luya jumped off immediately, her knees hitting the ground as she crouched beside Sul. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice shaking. She ran her hands over his legs, checking for any sign of serious injury. Sul nuzzled her shoulder gently, as if to say he was fine. But Luya's heart was in turmoil. The rules allowed them to continue, but she hesitated. What if he was more hurt than he let on? What if pushing him further caused lasting damage? She glanced toward the exit where the thought of walking away, of conceding defeat, seemed safer, smarter. But Sul had other plans. He snorted loudly, pawing at the ground with his uninjured leg. His eyes locked on hers, filled with determination. It wasn't just her dream riding on this competition. It was his too. "Okay," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "But only if you're sure." She climbed back into the saddle, her hands trembling as she adjusted her grip on the reins. The crowd, which had been murmuring anxiously, erupted into cheers as they moved forward again. The rest of the course was grueling. Sul's pace slowed, his body working harder to compensate for the stumble, but his spirit remained unbroken. Each jump was a test of endurance and trust, and with every obstacle they cleared, the crowd's cheers grew louder. By the time they approached the final jump, a massive triple bar that loomed like a wall, Luya's legs felt like jelly. Her voice was barely audible as she leaned forward and whispered, "One more, Sul. Just one more." Sul charged forward, his muscles coiling as he launched into the air. For a heartbeat, they seemed to hang suspended, the world holding its breath. Then his hooves hit the ground on the other side, clean and sure. The arena erupted in applause, the sound deafening. Luya slumped forward, burying her face in Sul's mane as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Among the cheering crowd, Santiago Alencar watched in silence. He had arrived unannounced, slipping into the stands to witness the competition firsthand. He had told himself it was mere curiosity, a way to gauge whether this horse was truly as remarkable as the stories claimed. But as he watched Luya and Sul cross the finish line, he felt something stir in his chest. Pride, regret, perhaps even admiration. For years, Santiago had believed that success came only through cold calculation and ruthless efficiency. But here, in this arena, he saw something different, something he couldn't ignore. After the awards ceremony, Santiago approached Luya for the first time. She was standing by Sol, her hands stroking his mane as he leaned against her. "You must be Santiago," she said, her voice cautious but steady. He nodded, his gaze shifting between her and the horse. "I came to see for myself," he admitted. And you've shown me something I didn't think possible." He paused, his expression softening. "I made a mistake, years ago, with Aurora. I didn't see her worth, but you did. And because of you, Sul is here today." Luya didn't respond immediately, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. "I'd like to help," Santiago continued, "not just with Sul, but with others like him, animals that deserve a chance. If you're willing to work with me, I want to make it right." The morning air was crisp as Santiago pulled his car into the driveway of Luya's modest farm. The engine's hum faded into silence as he stepped out, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. He spotted Luya by the paddock, her posture straight and guarded as Sul stood beside her, a towering symbol of strength and loyalty. "Good morning," Santiago greeted, his voice measured. Luya glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Morning," she replied curtly. It had been weeks since the competition, weeks since Santiago had first approached her with his proposal. And though she had listened politely, her doubts were plain. Today, Santiago hoped to change that. "I was hoping you'd give me the chance to show you something," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Something that might explain where I'm coming from." Luya raised an eyebrow, her arms crossing over her chest. "You think a tour of some fancy place is going to make me forget what you did to Aurora?" Santiago flinched at the accusation, but he nodded. "I don't expect you to forget. I wouldn't trust me either if I were you. But I'd like to prove that I've changed, not with words, with actions." For a moment, Luya was silent. Then she sighed, her hand brushing Sol's mane. "Fine, but I'm not promising anything." The drive to the facility was quiet, punctuated only by the occasional rattle of gravel under the tires. Santiago pulled into the gates of a ranch that was vastly different from the pristine operations he once managed. The buildings were simple but sturdy, the paddocks filled with horses of all shapes and sizes, many bearing scars of neglect and abuse. "What is this place?" Luya asked, stepping out of the car. Santiago gestured toward the paddocks. "This is where I've been trying to make amends," he said quietly. "It's a rescue ranch. We take in animals that have been abandoned, mistreated, or left for dead." As they walked, a stable hand approached with a smile, leading a horse with a crooked leg. "Mr. Alencar, good to see you," the man said warmly. "And you, Paul," Santiago replied before turning to Luya. "Paul runs the day-to-day operations here. He's the one who convinced me that this wasn't just about saving the animals, it's about giving them dignity." Luya watched as Paul spoke softly to the horse, coaxing it into a gentle trot despite its injury. She felt her defenses soften slightly, though her skepticism remained. Santiago led her to the far side of the ranch, where a mare and her foal grazed under the shade of a large oak tree. The mare's coat was patchy, her ribs still visible, but her eyes were bright, and the foal pranced around her with youthful energy. "That's Belle," Santiago explained. "She was found tied to a post in the middle of a storm, and her foal, Hope, was born just a few months ago. They've been teaching me more than I ever thought I could learn." Luya knelt by the fence, her fingers curling around the wood. She watched as Belle nudged Hope with her nose, the gesture tender and instinctive. She reminds me of Aurora, Luya admitted softly. She should, Santiago said, his voice heavy. When I saw Belle, I thought of Aurora too. I thought of what I did and what I almost destroyed. Luya stood, turning to face him. Why are you showing me this? Because I need your help, Santiago said simply. I've built this place, but I know it can be more. You've done something remarkable with Sol, something I don't fully understand, but I want to learn. You could help us make this about more than just survival. You could help us give these animals a future. Back at the farm that evening, Luya sat on the porch, her thoughts racing. Sul stood nearby, munching contentedly on hay, oblivious to the weight of the decision she faced. Her mother stepped outside, sitting beside her. You've been quiet since you got back, she observed. Luya sighed, resting her chin in her hands. He says he's changed, says he wants to make things right. And you don't believe him? I don't know, Luya admitted. Part of me wants to, but what if he's just doing this for himself, to make his name look good? Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder. Then make sure he isn't. If you decide to work with him, set the terms. Make it about the animals, not about him. Luya nodded slowly. You think it's worth the risk? I think, her mother said with a faint smile, that sometimes people surprise you. The next day, Luya met Santiago by the paddock. All right, she said, her voice firm. I'll work with you, but on my terms. Santiago raised an eyebrow. And those are? First, the animals come first. Always. If I see you're doing this for appearances or profit, I'm out. Second, this isn't about fixing your mistakes. This is about giving them what they deserve. Santiago nodded, his expression serious. Agreed. And one more thing, Luya added, stepping closer. You earn their trust the same way you're earning mine, by showing up day after day and doing the work. A faint smile crossed Santiago's lips. Fair enough. The soft glow of dawn crept over the small farm, painting it in hues of gold and amber. Sol stood in the paddock, his coat gleaming in the morning light, a living testament to strength and resilience. For Luya, he was more than just a horse. He was a miracle, the one who had pulled her family from the brink of despair and given them a second chance at life. 2 years ago, the farm had been a place of struggle. The walls of their small house leaned precariously, their wooden beams bowed under years of neglect. The fields lay barren, the soil dry and cracked from overuse and undercare. Every day was a battle to make ends meet, to scrape together enough to feed her siblings, her mother, and herself. But Sul changed everything. Sul's journey from a fragile foal to a champion and community hero wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story of transformation, for him, for Luya, and for everyone who had the privilege of knowing him. He had brought the family together in ways they hadn't thought possible, showing them that strength didn't just come from muscles or endurance. It came from love, trust, and the willingness to keep moving forward, no matter how difficult the path. And as Luya stood beside Sul one quiet evening, her hand resting on his broad shoulder, she whispered, You've given us everything, Sul, and I promise, we'll never let you down. Sul nickered softly in response, his warm breath brushing against her cheek. A simple, quiet acknowledgement of the bond they shared. A bond that had not only saved a life, but built a future.